I do in part agree, but let me give a couple of side views, if you will. First of all, no one counted on in this expose of the way things usually happen, whether it's Britain or the United States now, or you could go back to other empires. No one calculated on this character we have at the head of our government right now. No one counted on the situation that is becoming, I think, rather dire for the American empire being so accelerated, deepened, and made more profound by, I'm going to say it, not just a mercurial, strange, in some ways showing signs of deep dementia, um, grifter, what what other adjectives could I use? President with almost complete power because of a juncture of what I call the national security state, and it's being built since 1945 in particular in its present configuration. The 1947 National Security Act sort of laid out the outline for it. Harry Truman didn't like it. He didn't like the fact Paul Nitze had been associated with it for sure. But that state and then the other state. The other state is the predatory capitalist state. And of all things, we have in those 2 state building efforts since 1945 in particular, they've been nascent for our entire 250 plus years. I'd say for 300 years if you want to throw the British in there as an adjunct to it or a teacher of it. What you have now is you have crossovers in these 2 states. You have ExxonMobil, for example, whose prime customer in all the world is the Department of Defense. ExxonMobil being clearly a member of the predatory capitalist state, and the Pentagon being the premier member of the national security state. And the Pentagon's the greatest buyer of the product of the ExxonMobils and others in the capitalist state, the predatory capitalist state. And you have Lockheed Martin with a foot in both camp, as do most of the top 6 or 7 defense contractors. They're making weapons for the national security state, but they are very much in the latest, most highly paid members of the predatory capitalist state. So you have those 2 state building efforts that are crashing together right now since 1945, a morning, crashing together right now. And the whole apparatus is totally misunderstood, maybe not even capable of being understood, and being malused, and even in the configuration that they exist, malused by an idiot. How do you get this? How do you get out of this? How do you get it in the first place? How do you get out of it? I agree with your summary, though, that we are looking at another time where, and I think this is key for people who want to understand the global dynamics. Trump may be deepening them, making them more profound in certain areas, but he ultimately is not in control of these global dynamics, nor is anyone else in the West. We can fight and push and so forth, like we're doing, Europe in particular, us in particular. But you can't control these dynamics because I think they're inexorable. And you defined it. It's too simplistic for me to say it's the maritime powers versus the continental powers, with for the first time in about 2,000 years, the continental powers showing every bit of their strength and penchant for victory, and the maritime powers basically retreating. And let me footnote that for just a second and say the very, very singular, quintessential example of this, the maritime powers retreating, is gonna be when Iran sinks an aircraft carrier, or whoever does, someone's going to. Aircraft carriers, the capital ship of the maritime conglomeration, if you will, mostly in America, of course, but others have them. That's going down. And when it goes down, it is, to a certain extent, gonna take the maritime regime with it. The one reason that they aren't even approaching Iran is because 'cause they're deadly afraid of crossing that line where Iran will be the country that does it. Um, they're not Afghanistan, they're not Syria, they're not any of these countries you sail up to and send a few cruise missiles in and then say, "Ah, see what I did?" No, they're gonna knock out one of these capital ships that is the quintessential symbol of the maritime, group, if you will, led by the United States, of course. And to have added another land power, essentially land power, got some Navy, but Trump has destroyed the whole Navy. But it's essentially a land power, and it's a vast land power, size of Western Europe, 92, 93 million people, and in a good, solid geographic position with lots of natural resources that, if they were exploited properly, would make it even more powerful. Oil and gas aren't the only things they have. And you've added them to Russia and China. So now your continental powers are not only vast, they stretch across the world. Russia alone, the largest country in the world, add China to it, add Iran to it. Now the continental powers are awesome in their potential and in their actual strength. And the American empire and the maritime powers are receding. And in fact, the other powers in that group don't really add very much to the maritime element of their power. The only really strong maritime power, and that strength is bleeding away every day, is the United States. So, all to say that in this global struggle that is inexorable, I think, it was just or foreordained, if you will, by God and providence that this power was going to shift back to the east from whence it came 3,000 years ago, and China would be the primary magnet. All of that is being contested, of course, but the contest now is bizarre. And it's bizarre because of this gentleman, I use that term guardedly, sitting at the top of the American empire and the obeisance that the rest of the establishment, our founding fathers put together, is paying to him. The latest example of which is the Republicans caved and approved his lawyer as the attorney general, even though he's already de facto the attorney general. So it wasn't much of a move. But we are just taking apart the very fabric, domestic fabric of our being, our essence as a state in the world. At the same time, we're waging this contest with an utterly inept leader to wage it. And I'm not gonna say that there's too many people below him in the legislative or the courts or any of the other parts of the government that are competent enough to take over either, and I'm not even sure there's anyone competent enough to beat him in an election and to reverse the fortunes, if you will, from that perspective. So, we're in a pickle, Glenn. We are in a pickle, and because we did gain so much strength and we punished so many people in the world, and we destroyed so many civilizations in the world. I mean that. Um, we're now hated as much as we are looked at as being crazy, and I don't know how you compensate for that while you try to fix enough so that at least you can go out with a fairly decent, maybe something like England went out after the '56 Suez Crisis. Not a really good, example, but nonetheless, it's the end of empire. England had started, Britain had started going down long before that. But I don't know. I don't know how you put this in geopolitical terms, in strategic terms, in inexorable power shift terms, and deal with it with what we have in Washington right now. I don't know how you can take it apart. He should have been impeached. He should have been relieved of his duties. He should have been frog marched out of Washington. Indeed, he probably should be in jail, but he's not, which not on a lower scale demonstrates the inadequacy of our structure right now and the feebleness of our structure, as well as its having atrophied over the 250 years it's been in place. I'm reading David McCullough's John Adams right now for a second time, and I'm finding really uh, interesting comments in there from Adams, Jefferson, Madison, the whole group of them, Hamilton, Washington, even. I'm finding interesting comments that I highlight and then draw a line out and write a little marginalia about how that applies to today. And it's eerie how many of them saw this coming inchoately, but they nonetheless saw it coming Adams probably because he thought any democracy would kill itself eventually, but others saw it more in the terms I'm using now expressed in their language. Especially when the French Revolution broke out and everybody was kind of, Jefferson was over here. I love what the French are doing. And Adams over here saying what Burke was saying. Watch out. This is a tragedy of the first order. And out of that turmoil comes a sort of look into what's happening today that tells you we ain't getting out of this. This is the end. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that America's not a country in the world and got 340 million people and, trying to coexist and trying to get along. But it does mean our power's through. Our world spanning power is through. The question is, how do we deal with that in this short term that could be highly destructive, not only of ourselves, but others too, and get through it to a flat plane, if you will, that's reasonably accommodating of our reduced power and continue as a country. I don't know how we do that, Glenn, and that's really strange to be saying that at the age I am and coming to the end of my days and watching my country essentially commit suicide. And your use of the term and Krauthammer's use of the term and others too, Francis Fukuyama comes to mind immediately, of liberal democracy or liberal period, um, just makes a mockery of what we're doing. We are killing people on the high seas without due process of law. We have a president who talks about creating terror with his military. You know, we're the worst example of a great power going down that I can reflect on in history, at least modern history, in terms of the way we're doing it. And the damage we're doing to all the good, and there was some good, some real good that we did post World War II, for example. Um, it's unique in my study of history anyway. I don't think I've looked really hard at Mary Beard's book about Suetonius's 12 Caesars and the time between the establishment of the empire under Augustus after Julius Caesar was assassinated and all the way out to Domitian and those 12 Caesars and how everything went to hell there. And I think Mary Beard wrote that book with her tongue in her cheek, thinking about us as she was writing the book. You can see the innuendo throughout the text. Um, so how much of what happened to that empire, how much of what happens to any empire is a part of the character of its final or penultimate or somewhere towards the end leader? And how much is just the atrophy of power, the entropy, if you will? Um, I don't know, but I do know that this guy, Donald Trump, has put a special patina on the disappearance of the American empire in the clear and present danger of him being single-handedly capable of doing all this. And here's the kicker, and this takes me back to Adams and Jefferson, the American people not doing anything about it, period, because we aren't. We are marching, we are campaigning, largely in the same old vogue. We are doing all manner of things in the streets that we can get away with, but it's a very small group. The fundamental essence of the American people is quiescent. It's not doing anything. It's not raising its anger. It's not getting in the way. It's not throwing out roadblocks. It's not fomenting a civil war. It's not doing anything except watching. And MAGA, of course, is still, some of them anyway, watching and cheering. Although, as Judge Napolitano said the other day when I talked about the 26% approval rating, he said, I don't know anybody in that 26%. Do you? But that's curious. It's curious. Have we grown so fat and dumb And that's another throwback to Adams, where he says over and over again, the only way to, over time, protect any democracy is education. Well, we don't have education anymore. What we have is schoolhouses and a pretend education. So we've thrown that out. But I'm just racking my brain on how you might be able to get something going in this country to where you would arrest some of the deterioration enough to slow it considerably, and you would get rid of Trump. You'd have to get rid of Trump. You'd have to have that doesn't do it. You have to have a replacement, and you have to have a replacement that fundamentally grasps what we're talking about and sets about trying to do as much as he possibly or she possibly can to arrest its momentum. The first item of which would be what you were just talking about and what Trump said he was going to do, which is to recoup, to, to recalculate, to come home, if you will, from all these incredible burdens that we are trying to keep up, largely for monetary reasons. That's why I went through my notes after listening to your German general, and I'm looking at two episodes that told me one was a seminar with Bill Perry, then Secretary of Defense, the only engineer ever to have been, and his disquisition on no one had ever achieved shoot down of any airborne target more than 0.21. And as an engineer, he didn't think they ever would. Think about Patriot 2 and Patriot 3 right now, and all of Lockheed Martin's claims for all the rest of the missilery. Nothing on the ground is going to shoot anything coming in from the air, no matter what it is, down with a higher frequency than about 0.21% of the time, or 2 out of 10 targets. If they're nuclear, you're in trouble there. um, and at the same time, I was looking at what we were talking about at that particular seminar and that particular meeting with regard to what Bill had just brought back with him in terms of the idea about Russia. He'd just been to Moscow. And how did we go from Bill Perry, who at that particular moment in time echoed Colin Powell and Jim Baker and H.W. Bush and all the rest, and that German general too, that things were really looking good for that unipolar moment if we just made it multipolar immediately and husbanded, as it were, that manifestation into being, with the Russians being a polar, if you will, example of how that could be done and how it was going to be done. No, we sacrificed all that. And what did we sacrifice it for? We sacrificed it for money. And that was Bill Clinton's reason for expanding NATO. Money, because everybody salivated over the prospect of all those new NATO countries buying Lockheed Martin's products. And we expanded it finally with the group that grew up under George W. Bush and manifested itself mostly in the Biden administration. We decided we were going to take on this inexorable shift of power and start with Russia and use the expansion of NATO and in particular Ukraine as the proxy to do that. How did all this happen is my question. How did we go from that point that you rightfully call the unipolar point to so messing up the transition to the multinodal, multipolar, whatever phrase you want to use, world, that we now are the principal culprit for killing it in its cradle. And God knows what's going to replace it. I know ultimately what's going to replace it, the continental powers, China, Iran, Russia, and others that will join them. And it seems almost inevitable that those others will be joining them sooner rather than later. If a lot of them haven't already, they just haven't announced it.